After being estranged from my father for nearly 20 years, someone mailed me his urn. I never should have let that thing into my home. You're sure this thing is for me? I asked, studying the smooth red statue that had just been handed over. The young man on my doorstep narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw, clearly irritated that I wasn't putting an end to this transaction as fast as humanly possible. My question wasn't rhetorical, however, so I met his gaze and waited for an answer. I wasn't about to be pushed around by a kid who probably still needed to borrow his older brother's ID to buy cigarettes. Eventually, the boy released a cartoonishly exaggerated sigh from his lips, conceding to human decency. He looked down at the clipboard, flicking his neck to move a tuft of auburn-colored bangs out of his eyes to better see the paperwork. Well, is your dad? He paused, flipping through the packet of papers, the edges becoming stained a faint yellow-orange from some unidentified flavor dust that lingered on his fingertips. I suppressed a gag and continued to smile weakly at the boy, who was appearing younger and younger by the second. Adrian, redacted. Yes, that's my father's name, but I haven't spoken to him in nearly 20 years. He chuckled and flipped the paperwork back to the front sheet. Well, consider this a family reunion then, lady, 'cause you're holding him. Truthfully, I was a little flabbergasted, Adrian, and I had been estranged for 2 decades. No awkward phone call at Thanksgiving. No birthday card arriving in the mail 3 weeks late. Complete and total radio silence starting the moment I left my hometown for greener pastures. He hadn't even bothered to reach out after the birth of my only son 5 years ago. I'm fairly confident he was aware of Davy's birth too. My deadbeat sister still kept up with him, and she knew about my son. So as I further inspected the strange effigy, I found myself asking, why weren't Dad's ashes bequeathed to Victoria instead? Sure, she only used him for his money. To my sister, Adrian was a piggy bank, with a heartbeat that she shared some genetics with. But at least, she actually talked to the man. The decision to have this mailed to me upon his demise was inherently perplexing. I rolled the idol in my palm, feeling the wax drag over my skin. There was a subtle heat radiating from the object, akin to the warmth of holding a lit candle. But this thing sure wasn't a candle. I reflected it was an urn. The acne-ridden burlap sack of hormones that had been coating my property with Cheetos residue like soot. After the eruption of Pompeii, banged a pen against the clipboard. Lady, can you and Pop Pop catch up later? You know, like when I'm not here, I wanted nothing more than to knock the teeth out of his shit-eating grin. But I could hear Davy behind me tapping the tip of an umbrella against the screen door, giggling and trying to get my attention. As a single parent, I was his only role model, punching the lights out of a teenager. I contemplated probably wouldn't be a great behavior to model. With a calculated sluggishness, I picked up the pen and produced my signature on the paperwork. I took my sweet time, much to his chagrin. As soon as I dotted the last, the kid, ripped the clipboard from me and turned away, stomping off to his beat-up sedan parked on the curb. "Wash your hands, champ," I shouted after him. Once he had sped away, the car's sputtering engine finally fading into nothingness, I basked in the quiet of the early evening. Chirping insects, a whistling breeze and little else, the perpetual lullaby of sleepy suburbia. That silence made what Davy said next exceptionally odd. "Ah, Mommy, it's too loud. It's really too loud," he proclaimed, dropping the umbrella to the floor, pacing away from the screen door with his hands cupped over his ears. I spun around red effigy, still radiating warmth in my palm, listening intently, searching for the noise my son was complaining about. But there was nothing. The shrill chiming of our landline greeted me as I walked into the house screen door, swinging closed behind me. I suppose now is a good time to mention This all occurred in the late 90s. Cell phones. At least I didn't have the money to afford one back then. That must be the noise Davy was upset about, I thought. Logically though, that didn't make a lick of sense. He'd never objected to the sound of the phone ringing before, not once. I slapped the red effigy onto the kitchen table, rushing to put it down so I could answer the call before it went to voicemail. Hello. Oh hey, Alice. For a second, I was convinced you weren't going to pick up. Since you've been dodging my calls, I mean. My heart sank as Victoria's nasal toned voice sneered through the receiver. I shut my eyes and leaned my head against the kitchen wall, lamenting the choice to answer this call. I haven't been dodging your call, sweetheart. Being a single mom is a bit time-consuming, and I don't really have anything new to tell you. I can't repay you overnight. A few months prior, Davy had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and I was between employment, which meant we had no insurance and were paying the medical bills out of pocket, with limited options. And against my better judgment, I asked my sister for a loan. Honestly, I would have been better off indebted to the accuser. At least when you're unable to pay them, they'll accept a pinky finger as reimbursement. According to movie I watched at least. Okay, sweetheart, that's all well and good, but if you don't pay up soon, Child Welfare Services may get an anonymous call. A concerned citizen worried about Danny's safety in your home. I didn't bother correcting her for obvious reasons. If she were to ever make good on that threat, Victoria not even knowing my son's name would only bolster my chances at convincing social services that she was a heartless bitch, not a concerned citizen. So instead, I pulled my head from the wall and opened my eyes, about to hang up on her, right before I placed the phone on the receiver. However, the sight of the red effigy in my peripheral vision captured my attention. I held the phone in the air, hearing distant, static-laden hellos from Victoria as I stared at the object. Despite harboring my father's ashes inside its waxen confines, the figure sort of resembled a woman. It was hard to know for certain. Although it had the frame of a human being, the idol was mostly featureless, sleek and burgundy, like red wine frozen into the shape of a person. No face, no hair, no clothes. That said, its wide hips and narrow shoulders gave it a feminine appearance. Hands clasped together in a prayer-like gesture over its chest, almost resembling a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Gazing at it so intensely eventually caused a massive shiver to explode down the length of my spine. Clunky, but forceful like a rock slide. In spite of that sensation, I was transfixed. I creeped over to the idol on my tiptoes, as if I didn't want it to hear me approach, phone still in hand. It was remained inexplicably hot to the touch as I picked it up. For a moment, I regretted signing for the ominous delivery. At the same time, what was I supposed to do? Reject my father's ashes? Even though we were estranged, that just felt wrong. As I better inspected the urn, though my regret only became more acute. First off, there was no lid or cap to the damn thing. I assumed there would be a cork on the bottom or something, but that surface was just as smooth as the rest of it, so how did the ashes get inside? Not only that, but when I tilted the effigy upside down, desperately searching for where exactly my father's ashes had been inserted into the mold, an unexpected noise caused me to nearly jump out of my skin. It rattled. My father's supposedly cremated remains rattled. Rising fear resulted in me clumsily hurling the thing back down. If I'm remembering correctly, I basically lobbed it at the table like a softball pitch. Despite that, it didn't roll across the surface. It didn't break into a few pieces or tumble onto the floor. In a singular motion, it landed perfectly upright. Somehow, the base of the effigy stuck to the table, like it had been magnetized to its exterior. I slowly lifted the phone back to my ear. "You still there, Vic?" I asked, whispering. "Yeah, Jesus, I'm still here. Where'd you go?" I was totally kidding before Alice. You know that. I do really need that money though. Made some bad gambles recently. Cutting her off before the inevitable tangent, I whispered another question. "Have you talked to Dad recently?" The line went dead. I listened to the thumping of Davy moving around in his room directly above me as I waited for a reply. Eventually, she responded, her tone laced with the faintest echoes of fear, maybe, like a year ago. "Nothing since then. Why you never ask about Dad? You finally reach out to him or something?" Briefly, I considered answering, explaining in no uncertain terms the uncanniness of the urn that was now haunting my kitchen table. But somehow, I knew I shouldn't. To this day, I can't decipher the reasoning behind my intuition. Call it an extrasensory premonition or the gut instincts of a mother. But I held my tongue. That decision likely saved mine and my son's life. I hung up without another word. It began to ring again immediately, but ignored it. Ignored it a second and a third time too. I stood motionless in front of the landline, waiting for Victoria to give up. After the fifth unanswered call, the room finally went silent. Once a minute had passed without another ring, I felt confident that she was done extorting me. For the time being, at least, shaking off my nervous energy with a few shoulder twists, I walked out of the kitchen down the hallway until I reached the stairs and shouted up to Davy, "Honey, come down and help me with dinner." I heard my son erupt from his bedroom, slamming the door behind him, sneakers tapping against the floorboards as ran. When he came into view, grinning excitedly, I painted a very artificial smile on my face, masking my smoldering apprehension for his benefit, before his foot even touched the first stair. However, his grin evaporated, replaced by a deep frown alongside a shimmer of profound worry behind his eyes. Once again, he cupped his hands over his ears and screamed down to me, "Mom!" "It's still too loud. The man is laughing and dancing so loud. Can you please tell him to stop?" The curves of my artificial smile began to falter and fade, despite my attempt to maintain the facade of normality. Other than my son's deafening words, the house was completely silent, devoid of any and all sound. And there was only one thing that was different. In another example of unexplainable intuition, I marched into the kitchen, picked up the effigy, plus the certificate that it came with, and walked down into the cellar. Ignoring the eerie heat simmering in my palm, I made my way to the darkest corner of the unfinished basement and placed my father's rattling ashes behind a stack of winter coats. By the time I returned to the kitchen, Davy was already there rummaging through the pantry. "All better, love bug." He paused his scavenging for a second, perking his ears. "Pretty much. I can still hear him giggling, but it doesn't hurt my head. Can we have spaghetti for dinner?" That was the worst of it for a few months, without Davy complaining about the volume of the laughing Eric dancing man. I forgot about the effigy. Make all the comments you want about my lack of supernatural vigilance. Call me a moron or brain dead. It's okay. I've called myself all those things and much, much more 1,000 times over. Since these events, I was a single mum, working 2 jobs, protecting and raising my kid the best I knew how. Credit where credit is due, though. I caught on before it was too late. It started with the ants. In the weeks prior to the delivery of the red effigy, our home had become overrun with tiny black invaders, and I couldn't afford to hire an exterminator. Instead, I settled for the much cheaper option: ant traps. At first, I thought I was wasting my money, They didn't seem to be making a dent in the infestation. Then out of nowhere, the ants disappeared without a trace. Some kind of noiseless extinction event that took place without me noticing. Maybe the traps did work, just took some time, I thought. Then one night, I was bending over at the fridge, selecting a midnight snack. As I grabbed some leftovers, the dim, phosphorescent glow coming from the appliance highlighted subtle movement by the cellar door. I stood up and squinted at the movement, but I couldn't tell what the hell it was. Honestly, it looked. Some invisible person was a drawing. A straight line in pencil between the backyard door and the entrance to the basement obsidian graphite dragging against the tile floor. I rubbed sleep from my eyes, but the bizarre phenomena didn't change. When I flicked the kitchen light on, I better understood what was happening, but I had no clue why it was happening. A steady stream of black ants was silently making their way into the cellar, more irritated than frightened in that moment. I traced their cryptic migration down the creaky stairs, assuming they had been attracted to some food Davy absent-mindedly left in the cellar. But when I saw that the procession of living dots were heading for the area behind the winter coats, the irritation spilled from my pores with the sweat that was starting to drench my t-shirt. I hadn't thought about the red effigy in some time. As I peeked behind the stack of fleeces and windbreakers, I almost didn't recognize it. It had tripled in size. The figure wasn't praying anymore either. Now it was lying in the fetal position, knees tucked to its chest, head resting on the ground. Ants entered the wax, but they didn't come out. One by one, they gave their bodies to the red effigy as my horror hit a fever pitch, vibrating in my chest like a suffocating hummingbird. I could have sworn the idol tilted its smooth, featureless face to glare at me. I swung around and bolted up the stairs. Didn't sleep much that night. Not a wink after what I witnessed in the cellar. I paced manic laps around the first floor of my home all through the night, desperately trying to process the encounter. As the sun rose, however, I hadn't figured much out. I wasn't convinced what I saw was real. If it was real, God forbid I had no fucking idea what to do about it. Exhausted to where I became fearless and dumb, I plodded the stairs, snow shovel in hand, determined to throw my father's supposedly incinerated corpse into the garbage. The morning light, pouring in through a dusty window near the ceiling, made the process exponentially less terrifying, at least at first. When I reached the idol, I came to the gut-wrenching conclusion that I hadn't hallucinated its transformation. It was still the size of a toddler. I didn't dwell on the unexplainable that would have paralyzed me to the point of catatonia. Instead, I focused my attention solely on getting that red curse out of my fucking house. I arced back with the shovel and slid it under the wax. Briefly, I stopped readying myself to sprint out of the cellar at breakneck speed if the effigy came to life in response to my intrusion. It remained inanimate, and I cautiously placed my hands back on the handle, attempting to lift the wax idol, attempting and failing to lift it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much energy I put into the action, it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move it an inch. Dumbfounded, I let the shovel clatter to the floor and left the cellar to get Davy ready for school. Locked the door behind me just in case. Over the next week, I enlisted 3 separate men, each of them strapping and Herculean in their own right, to help me try to move the blossoming urn. Instructed them not to touch it. Another baseless intuition that turned out to be correct when it was put to the test. My ex-boyfriend couldn't lift it with the shovel, and he was able to bench press 400 pounds. My plumber, a person I'd been friendly with for years, couldn't lift it either. When he tried to push the idol, as opposed to lifting it with the shovel, the grizzled man screamed bloody murder, having sustained 3rd-degree burns on the inside of both hands from the attempt. My pastor wouldn't even go into the cellar. He gripped the golden cross around his neck as he peered into the depths, quivering and wide-eyed. Told me I needed someone to exorcise the property as he jogged out the door. I asked him if knew any such person, but he said nothing and continued on jogging. In a moment of obscene bravery, I went into the cellar by myself and retrieved the certificate that came with the idol. If strength wasn't the answer, then I needed a more cunning approach. Figured reviewing the documentation that came with it was a good place to start. There wasn't much to review, however. The certificate barely had anything on it, other than my father's name. As I stared at the piece of paper trying to will an epiphany into existence, I noticed something that caused my heart to drop into my stomach like a cannonball. Although I made it manifest, the epiphany didn't help me much in the end, unfortunately. My father's middle initial was T, but the paper listed his middle initial as L. All the men on my dad's side of my family were named Adrian, as it would happen. If the certificate was to be believed, this wasn't my father's ashes. It was my great-grandfather's ashes. The last night Davy and I stayed in that house, I jolted awake to the sound of my son shrieking from somewhere below me. Ever since I discovered the red effigy had grown, he had been sleeping in my bedroom right next to me. My son wasn't in bed when I heard the wails, so I launched myself out of bed, sprinting toward the cellar. If I had been paying more attention, I may have noticed the light under the closed bathroom door that I passed on my way there. Seconds later, I was at the bottom of the basement stairs. I flipped the cellar light on, but the bulb must have burnt out because nothing happened. In the darkness, I could faintly see Davy kneeling over the red effigy, screaming in pain. Before I could even think I was across the room, reaching out my hand to grab my son's shoulder and pull him away from it. When I heard another noise from behind me, instantly I halted my forward motion, fingertips hanging inches above the shadow-cloaked figure I assumed was my son Mom, who's screaming. Davy shouted from the top of the cellar stairs. My brain struggled to process the bombardment of sensations, emotions, and conflicting pieces of information. I lingered in that position, statuesque and petrified, until an onslaught of searing agony wrenched me from my daze. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see two shapes in front of me, and neither of them were Davy. There was the idol still curled into the fetal position, and then there was the thing I was leaning over, which was just the thin silhouette of a child's head and shoulders, without any other body parts connected to the idol by a waxy thread that had been hidden from view by the pile of coats. A tendril had grown from the silhouette's head and was now enveloping the ring and middle fingers of my outstretched hand. Never in my life have I experienced a more devastating pain. With all the force I could muster, I threw myself backward. There were the sickening snaps of tendons accompanied by the high-pitched crunching of knuckles, and then my spine hit the ground hard. Both of my fingers had been torn off, absorbed into the wax, leaving two bleeding stumps on my hand, fragments of bone jutting out of the ruptured flesh like marble gravestones. Adrenaline, thankfully, is an astounding painkiller. By the time I had scooped up, Davy put him in the car and started accelerating away from that house. I didn't feel a thing anymore. While I was being treated for my injuries at the hospital, I contemplated what to do next. My fear was that this thing wanted specifically me or my son, and wouldn't settle for anyone else. So even if I moved me and Davy across the country, jumping from shelter to shelter, would that really be enough? Would we ever truly be safe? In the end, I'm sort of grateful that the idol ingested those two fingers. Being with Davy in the same hospital that had treated him for pneumonia reminded of my debt, and that gave an idea. If the red effigy wanted us, maybe I could offer it a close second. Once I had been stitched up, I picked up the phone and called Victoria. "Hey, I have a proposition for you. I'll give you the house as compensation for my debt, as long as you throw in a few grand on top. You can easily sell it for 20 times that you know. Never heard from Victoria again. After I traded the deed for cash, Davy and I moved across the country, starting fresh in a new city. No surprise deliveries at our new home for over 20 years either. Until now, today is my birthday, and I received something in the mail. The return address is our old home. With trembling hands, I peeled the letter open and removed the card that was inside. Here's what the message said. Dear Alice, I apologize about not reaching out all these years. Truthfully, I imagined you'd still be angry at me and Granddad, but I'm hoping you'll get this card and let bygones by bygones. I want you to know that Victoria was my first choice for the urn. However, at the time, she owed me a great deal of money. To avoid payment, your sister convinced me she was in prison, which made her an unsuitable choice for what I would expect are obvious reasons after what happened to your fingers. In the end, however, I suppose it all worked out as it was meant to. Please call Chagish XXX. I look forward to 4 of us spending time together. Happy birthday, Dad attached. There's a Polaroid of my father and another man standing next to him. Dad looks exactly as I remember him when I left home, and that was almost half a century ago, and the other man looks a lot like him. Davy is away at college. He hasn't answered my calls for the last 2 days. Once I post this, I suppose I'll call my father. Wish me luck.